Dr. Ross Tucker, welcome to Breakfast with Refilo again. How are you this morning?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Excellent. So let's kick off with the first topic, and that's, of course, about these advantages in sport that are perceived to be unfairly attained. Whether it be the hormones, we've got an increasingly inclusive Olympic Games where we have a transgender athlete in the form of New Zealand's weightlifter Lauren Hubbard, but that hasn't seemed to affect the perspective of including her amongst the transgender women, notwithstanding testosterone's help. And then finally, the unfair advantage of doping and drugs. Which is the most critical of these to pay attention to in the coming years?
The one that is the most common or highest in volume will be doping. That's been a problem in sport for 100 years, and it's not going to go away. So in terms of the integrity of the outcome, doping will continue to be the main one. I mean, there are studies that have been done, and you can decide whether you believe that they're reliable or not, where they've asked athletes whether they're doping or not, and anything between 20 and 50% of athletes will say yes. So if you take that at face value, if there are 11,000 athletes in Tokyo, you could be looking at 5,500 dopers in the Tokyo Olympics. So that's clearly the biggest challenge for sport in terms of trust.
Yes.
But the most emotive or intense one is the transgender one. And next week in the weightlifting event for women, the first transgender athlete from New Zealand who you've alluded to will participate. And the discussion around that will be the fiercest, I think, that there's ever been in sports. It's going to be actually quite unpleasant.
I suspect so, and it's such a personal thing, which is unfortunate. But let's talk a little bit about that. She'll be competing against her female cohorts in the same weight category. And has there been that kind of invasive questioning about her testosterone levels?
Oh, yes. It's been a massive discussion for the last 6 months since I think people saw that she would qualify. Then she was named in the team, and it peaked again, and it'll peak again next week. It is such a hot topic because it speaks to social factors. It speaks to identity. And a lot of people are saying, well, women particularly are standing up and saying, hang on, we have a protected, closed category in sport for a reason. And when you start to now allow biological males who've benefited from male hormones during their development and early adulthood to enter our category, we're saying, hang on, this is not fair. So that's the one side. The other side is saying that we should celebrate identity and people's rights to express themselves and behave and identify as they wish. And so what it creates fundamentally is a colliding rights issue. You've got women on one side of the debate and trans advocates on the other, and there is unfortunately no solution. But this collision of rights cannot be reconciled to the satisfaction of both sides. So one has to ultimately choose.
Ross, let's think about this, right? So I want to tell myself that I think I operate from a relatively strong moral compass and bend towards like history, the arc of justice. The arc of history bends towards justice and all that. So I want to say that if we are inclusive of transgender people, we are inclusive of transgender people. And it is a difficult one because people sometimes will be transgender without any hormonal or reassignment surgery, and therefore may well present as male, even if they know that they are not necessarily within. And it raises the question, I mean, let's say that the world becomes more inclusive and in like a decade, 2 decades time, will there be a need for gender categories or room for it?
Sport is biology. I mean, obviously it's a lot more, and we might get onto the mental side in a moment, but fundamentally sport is biology, it's physiology. So an athlete in weightlifting is being tested to see how much weight they can lift, and that's a function of muscle strength, tendons, coordination, the brain. And gender is not biology. So I cannot see, and I'm confessing here a little bit that I'm admitting my bias is as a physiologist. I'm a biologist.
Sure.
I can't see that gender categories work. The category of women's sport exists because sex drives performance. So sex means the testosterone, which affects the muscle mass, the muscle strength, the body fat, the heart, the lungs. And so I think we have to ask, and I appreciate this moral question that you raised, this imperative. I think we have to ask, why does women's sport exist? It exists to ensure fairness and safety and integrity of the result for women. Well, why? Because they don't benefit from testosterone and other male hormones. And so therefore you can't just create a gender category to bypass it, because it's not fair for a whole class of humans who will never have access to those androgen hormones.
Sure, that's important actually. And I really like the way that you make a clear distinction between sex and gender. The other thing that's concerning with respect to quote unquote protecting and these colliding rights is that let's step away from the transgender argument and let's get back to biology, as you rightly point out. These rare occasions that Acosta Semenya comes forward, where she has every right to be included in that protected class, but the biology is taking her to a different kind of categorization, and then now she is not protected any longer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so those are complicated. I mean, I speak about transgender sometimes being a complex issue. It's actually not that complicated compared to this. So what's happening there is you have a condition that's 1 in 5,000 maybe. And what happens is then you get a person who's identified as female at birth, but for a couple of different reasons, as they grow up and reach puberty and adolescence, they still benefit from the male hormones like testosterone and its sort of family members. And that happens because chromosomally or genetically they are male, XY, and they produce high levels of testosterone from testes. And so the argument then is, does that advantage come as a result of arising out of a different biological category, a biological sex in effect? And so when World Athletics created their policy, their argument was that Caster Semenya and other athletes who are competing also with DSDs, and there are a couple that we now know about, are actually biological male who haven't developed the male characteristics fully and therefore belong in that category. So that's the argument. They're treating DSDs exactly as if they're trans. Now, as a concept, they're actually, in a sense, correct, because if women's sport exists to keep people who've had androgens, testosterone, and other male hormones out, then that would also apply to athletes like Caster Semenya. The problem is that it creates all kinds of ethical and social issues, because now you've got sport telling people what they are or are not, and that's where it gets really tricky.
That's the one thing, Dr. Tucker. But then the other thing is, for example, if you found something where a person had higher levels of it in the male category, there's no other gender to push them to, or any kind of testosterone limiting, or, as I mentioned in my example, Michael Phelps is not asked to cut up his wingspan.
Yeah, so on the first part, the male category is sort of thought about as the open one. There is no higher category, so we don't protect people who don't belong in it. So use the analogy of boxing. We have weight classes. Like, there's no upper weight limit in the heavyweight division. So because we've decided, and you can argue whether it's arbitrary or not, but that anyone above, say, 110 kilograms doesn't need to now be measured for mass. But we do regulate the middleweights, so you can't compete as a lightweight if you're above or whatever it is. So that's the argument there. With respect to Phelps's arm span, similarly, we don't have a category for swimmers with short arms. So we've decided that we don't need to quote unquote protect fairness or integrity of the results with that particular advantage. In the same way that we don't have a category for basketball for short people, but we don't have a category, for instance, for sprinting for people with slow twitch muscles.
Yeah, there's clear advantage there. Okay, let's talk about speaking of sprinters, Sha'Carri Richardson, the U.S. fastest woman in the United States, 100-meter runner, who was excluded from the solo race, the solo heats and competition on the basis of having marijuana in her bloodstream. Definitely, she admits to it. She apologizes. She takes all the responsibility for it. No fight there. But honestly, Dr. Tucker, if sports is biology, is there a real advantage that comes from marijuana, and is it appropriate that it's still included since it's been legalized in so many places around the world, and that's the way the history is moving? Is it still appropriate to have it?
Yeah, so this is another example actually where social factors collide with sports, and it's interesting actually why marijuana is on the banned list in the first place. Is way back in the 1980s, short history lesson here, when they were developing the banned list code, like what substances should be banned in sport, the U.S. government actually lobbied very aggressively to put marijuana on it because it linked in with a broader fight that they were having against recreational drug use. And they wanted to stigmatize it, and therefore it was placed on the sporting banned list because it would help their efforts to get it also off the street. And then it never came off. There's no evidence at all that it's really performance enhancing. Right. I mean, you could argue that it's relaxing for an athlete and it might be part of dealing with stress, which of course then might indirectly allow better performances. But it's nowhere near a drug like testosterone or EPO or growth hormone or any of the other things that athletes are using. And I suspect that given that it's now societally more accepted than ever, it won't be long before it's taken off that list. And Richardson might be the high-profile catalyst that accelerates that.
It looks as though President Joe Biden is behind actually taking that off, which is funny because Mr. Just Say No was also an American president. Finally, and I'm so sorry we're out of time basically, but just a quick sort of perspective from you on the mental health issue, the increased, I suppose, power that sporting stars have to define their path on the basis of their health. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we saw last night with Simone Biles. It's received a huge amount of attention. I was just reading up this morning before speaking to you. The most remarkable thing there is not that she had this mental health issue. It's that it took the responsibility upon herself to withdraw from the competition for the sake of the team. So the self-awareness to do that is remarkable. And I was thinking about it this morning. Imagine it was an ankle injury, and the news headlines this morning were that Biles had to withdraw because she had an ankle injury. It would be a headline, but no one would discuss it.
Correct.
But there's a stigma around mental health, and you'll see this because people will portray it as weakness on her part that makes it so remarkable that she's come out to do it. So in that sense, it's almost encouraging that it's happening now because it might help resolve the stigmas around it a little bit, because athletes are obviously under tremendous pressure. Part of being an elite athlete is dealing with that pressure. So we can't say, oh, we've got to make things easier for athletes. It's one of the key things that produces Olympic legends, is the ability to deal with that pressure. But she's shown she can do that. She's done the Olympics. She's won the world titles. So whatever it is that got to her is probably an accumulation of COVID and the sex abuse scandal and the cumulative effect of that pressure over many, many years, maybe knowing it's her last Olympics and so on. So I think there's a point at which we have to say, actually, how much do we expect of these athletes? They're not simply there like gladiators in the arena for entertainment and then dispose of them when they're done, So awareness is good, I think, in this regard.
A powerful way to end this off. Thank you so much, Dr. Ross Tucker, sports scientist at the Science of Sport. We'll close out right now.
Breakfast with Refilwe Molota on Cape Talk.